Dude, I don't know where to start. My hands are sweating preparing for this conversation that we're going to have.
It's hard to describe at times, right? I think there are moments where I go through moments of like panic, moments of like live in the moment and be joyous. I go through just a range of emotions and things that I feel like I go through way too often, you know. But I'm excited to have this conversation because I feel like what we initially had planned was right at the time. Right, we were going to talk about teams. We were going to talk about how to work in the remote space. But given what's been going on lately, I appreciate you offering to have a different conversation. I think one that a number of people want to hear, want to be a part of, and I'm lucky enough to have it with you.
Thanks, man. Yeah, I got to say, I was a little bit kind of scared and uncertain, even trying to think about how to prepare for a conversation like this in the platform that we have. And, I really appreciate you giving me some space and kind of partnership to allow me over the last 3 episodes that we've had together to grow through the lens of equity in the work that we do and with the schools. But one of the things that I would say that slapped me in the face this week for somebody like me who doesn't have a lot of the regular race or equity conversations on a frequent basis. My mom never talked to me about it that much. I'm in situations where it's not often discussed in social environments. It's tiring and it's taxing and it's mentally weighing. And I just realize how hard it is for people of color to have these conversations on a regular basis.
Mm-hmm. What from your experience, and I'll share mine in a minute, from like what are the things that you're finding to be most taxing and the most challenging? Like what space are you in right now because of all of this? Like speak a little bit to that.
That's a tough question. I think for the first time, I mean, I've gone to places like, South Central or Detroit, and where like I felt like it was rough. And one of the things that I realized with the kind of the looting that was happening and the rioting that was happening in San Francisco this week was I was worried for my city. I was worried for my mom who's, by herself and kind of in a dense area. And there were helicopters flying by, and I felt unsafe to even go out and run or do the things I normally did. And I realized that there are people that live like that every single day. And so to answer your question, I think the thing that was hard for me to kind of bring out is that like I am in a position where I don't even want to use. I just have there's so much gift in my everyday life that I underappreciate it, and now I feel like we're having to talk about the gifts that people don't have, and some things that it shouldn't even be a gift. It should be a human right. Just to talk about those things in when you have those things is really hard.
I think what what I hear you saying, and what I think a lot of folks are grappling with is just, I think a lot of people realize some of the injustice and inequalities and inequities that exist in the world, but I think more than ever we're seeing it. And I think it was Will Smith the other day came out with a statement about it's not that there's more of these incidents where Black bodies are being violated. It's just now that they're being filmed. Mm-hmm. And we're in a space now more than ever, and in some ways thankful for smartphones, because now the rest of America is seeing what Black people have been talking about for years, and it's real, and we're able to confront it in a way that I feel like we haven't in the past. It's going to be soon about action, which we can talk to later. But I think the biggest thing that I'm taking away from this moment and the space that I'm sitting in is this very complex problem that I think people have avoided looking at solutions for, right? I think we continue to say, um, when things come up, there's a lot more conversation. When things die down, those conversations go away. And then, therefore, even fewer actions take place. And so, at what point do we, as Americans, as people, as humans, just say, like, enough is enough? And this is not how you treat the person next to you, regardless of their skin color. This is not how I want to be experienced in the world every single day, as if I have to walk down one side of the street and then cross over if I see a white person walking down the street, and feel like I can cross back over now that they pass. Like, no one wants to live their life that way, but that's the way I live life. That's every day. And I think for the first time, and for some, and hopefully not the first time for others, they're seeing this to be a reality. And at some point, we have to get to action. Even our organization right now, or just think about organizations who are putting out statements in general, and they're trying to figure out what to do internally, externally. Like, you know, what do you see us doing? And I feel like today was a good example of some steps we've already taken. But I'm curious to hear from you, what steps should organizations take, especially in this, kind of remote environment, right? In this remote space.
One of the things that, like I mentioned, I appreciate about the conversations that you and I have on a pretty regular basis is I feel totally safe. And I feel like I could ask advice and get your thoughts, just like the text messages that I sent you earlier this morning, whether just to provide me some additional perspective. And it's been super helpful for me to develop a little bit more confidence to even be on this video, right? To be even public about it, because I would say even a few months ago, I lacked practice and fluency and comfort and talking about some things. And, as of the last couple of weeks, I've been talking to districts that we work with about equity things that I notice, or help them redirect some resources towards things that might help them achieve their equity goals. And so just because I talk about it more, I feel much more confident that some of the suggestions that I'm providing our clients are the right ones.
I think you're hitting something right on the head. And I feel like, as I've seen, as a former superintendent, I've seen, as a principal and as a district leader in many different ways, there's an apprehension to have this conversation, right? There's just a feeling like this is a conversation you can't have, you shouldn't have. And therefore, people don't talk about it. And so if you don't have the, we used to call them at bats, you don't have the opportunities, you don't have the fluency, to use your words, to speak about this, we actually don't become complete as people, because we're avoiding a part of us that wants to engage in a way of understanding. And I have to also be clear, that's not everyone. I'm hoping it's more people than it is the few that don't want to engage in conversations about race and equity. But I'm still optimistic that there's a majority of people who are sitting there saying, I don't know how to engage in this conversation. And what you just articulated is just try. Like, that's the
Yeah.
first step. And like getting out there and making the attempt to talk to someone, a group, and finding space where you feel comfortable enough to just be a part of the conversation. The second thing I think, and appreciate you for spending a lot of time doing, because I see the things that you're reading because you forwarded them on to me. But I mean, a lot of what white America has to do if they want to be allies or co-conspirators with people of color is they have to do their homework. It's they have to go out and find resources that will help them understand the world around us, the world that they live in, but unfortunately don't have to encounter in so many ways, and spend time learning and spend time finding out answers themselves. I just remember when I was in first or second grade, and I was actually born, which I don't even think I told you, I was born with gray hair. So everyone always was curious, like, why do I have gray hair in the middle of my head? And it was always an avenue for them to ask about the texture of my hair. And as a 7-year-old, you don't really think about it. But as you get older and you realize that people are, they're curious about who you are, but there are certain things you say and ask that are inappropriate that you have to do your own homework on, those are the type of things that, we are hoping that our white allies or white co-conspirators will do and engage in, so that we can have a rich conversation together and move forward together. But it starts with trying.
When you described that, it reminded me of when you and I first started working together, and you had all these questions around, how do you go online with a website and write content, or how do you become a consultant? And I remember thinking how uncomfortable you felt, and some things that seemed so simple to me seemed so complex to you. And this morning, as I was reflecting on our conversation today, I was just like, I'm in David's shoes right now. Like, I'm feeling the complexity of even something more complicated than being a consultant or writing a blog post. This is very complicated emotional stuff that does require daily reflection for me to feel like I have some clarity, because even the folks that I talk to, my friends of color who are dealing with this now and they talk about it regularly, they're struggling to sort through this. And so I can only imagine that I'm just feeling a small percentage of what people are feeling.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And that's the other piece that is so hard to wrap my head around. As a Black man, I'm able to, um, I see so much of what goes on. I feel it on a daily basis, but there's also just a realize that I have a level of privilege that allows me to live in a certain neighborhood where I may not engage in the complexities of this every single day, even though I know it sits there for so many people in so many different ways, which makes it even more complex problem, And so this is a moment in time that seems to become more frequent than just the moment. It's something that we're interacting with more regularly, that draws a level of concern, I think, for so many people, in a way that means that we have to get to some sort of action. And part of it is understanding that it is extremely complex and that there has to be some level of grace as we navigate some of this, but also that grace doesn't mean inaction, that grace doesn't mean blatant racism, that grace means that there are people that are going to try to understand more deeply. And as organizations, we have to find ways to help them. And get them the resources that are necessary to understand the complexity. Because like you said, and I have to say, I'm still not completely clear on all the in and outs of the consultant side of the world, but it is that analogy is so genius, because it highlights something that happens when someone is trying something new. When we engage with new content, a new focus, a new direction, it causes a moment of pause of like, how do I do this? How will I be judged? How do I ensure that my message comes off clear? And if it doesn't, do I now regress back to saying nothing? So this happens in these same type of conversations where it's new, it's uncomfortable, and people don't know how to wrap their hands around it. So they either make one of two choices. They try again, they try to find a way in, or they regress and decide not to talk about it. And we have to find ways to get more people to try to wrap their hands around it in small chunks and understanding what is going on around them. What do you think about, Anthony, when we see what has happened in this past week across our country, and what we've continued to see in Black America in particular, of many Black people are falling victim to these just undescribable situations that happen way too often because of the color of skin. And then you think about the idea that there are kids that then go to school and are expected to be educated to do right in this world in which they're told that they're not right anyway. So how do you bring this conversation, or how do you see, us bringing this conversation to education spaces, and helping school districts in this very tough time? Like, what do we need to consider?
I think people had a lot of check the box actions, where every strategic plan I've seen has something about equity in it. I never realized how inequitable things were until COVID-19 came about. Like it just widened my eyes. And I think the reason I started talking about responsiveness, equity, and personalization, and I added equity to my repertoire of things that I think are levers to change education, is because I don't think we were doing it right. And there's umpteen examples of schools that have talked about not offering services to kids because it wasn't equal amongst all of them. And between that and your analogy around the cactus and the rose bush and maybe the new sunflower that you talked about last, aligned really well with me in terms of the gifts that I've gotten as when I was young, as a raised by a single mom who had two jobs. And it's when those educators have seen me as someone, as an individual who needs extra attention to reach my potential, that I felt more successful, not when I was treated equal. There's some challenges with setting it up that way. I think one of the things that I've been thinking about this weekend also is that because of the way we feel about and understand equity, we actually make it hard for kids to fail. And I don't think that as a result, it's possible for people to reach full potential without ever failing.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, everything you said resonates with me, and I feel like when I think about uh, what educators can do, it's another complex challenge, right? Because I see it in my head. I have a picture of an educator who's giving their all instructionally and providing instructional lesson plans and planning through the weekend and grading papers, and the list of things that educators have to do every single day are mountain high. However, the one thing that I feel that educators um, don't get enough credit for is their ability to spend time to find out individual aspects of every child. And that speaks to equity. And part of that is because I feel like policy in general has boiled down the educational experience to the ability to master a standard. When you and I or anyone else filled out their first job application, they didn't care if we mastered standard 1.1a, right? They wanted to know how well we were able to communicate. They wanted to know if you were a person that could add value to the organization. They were asking for us to be critical thinkers and collaborative partners. They weren't asking us for how we did on our algebra test. So educators are put in a position where they're unable to create those spaces for kids, but the best educators out there make sure they make time for that social emotional development. They make time for those relationships and the understanding of the world around them. In particular, I feel like I need to give a shout out to one of mine who's retiring this year. Mrs. Diaz, if you're out there watching, I appreciate everything you've done for me, because Anthony, to your point, what she did for me was more than just teach me reading and writing. She spent time to know who I was and what I needed to be successful. Up until 2 weeks ago, I spoke to her 2 weeks ago just to see how she was. She's the type of person who made sure that I became someone in the world, period. And she dedicated time and energy to finding a way to put me in spaces where I could grow. And I feel that's what education needs now more than ever, is rethinking, when we say education, what are we asking our kids to experience, and what do they need to experience to live in the world that we're creating for them, and creating pathways to see that come alive.
Thing I think I've seen a lot of folks struggle with also is the amount of appropriate time. And I think people kind of conflate it with or oversize it, because when I don't know about you, but all of the moments that I remember that really made a difference in my youth with teachers, they were like 5-minute interactions. They weren't like 5-hour long interactions. And there were several 5-minute interactions that happened over the course of time. So it's more about the intent and the cadence as opposed to the amount. Because I think one of the things that teachers and educators struggle with is like, I'm serving X number of students, 120 students. How do I do that with everybody? It's like, you kind of, it's like sprinkling a lot of these interactions very intentionally with people, and you can't do it intentionally if you don't know them.
That's right. That's right. I agree. I think it's the sprinkle. It's the moments. It's not the length of the moment. It's the actual moment. And I feel uh, if we were to go down and write down a list of 10 things that we experienced in school, it would probably be like the 2-minute conversation that we had in the teacher in the hallway. It's not the 45-minute lesson plan. It's not the 60-minute lecture. It is the moments in which we felt cared for and individualized in a positive way that made us think differently. I mentioned Mrs. Diaz. I can talk about my high school basketball coach and the extra sprints that he gave me that lasted 2 minutes that I'll never forget the rest of my life. But like all of those individual moments add up to the moments that I remember and the people that I remember because how much they paid attention to my personal growth. So and I get it, at the same time, it's overwhelming at times for teachers when they say, I have 120 students across 6 periods. And, you can overwhelm yourself with the magnitude of responsibility that you have, but you'll be surprised about how important that 60-second conversation, that extra 60-second conversation times 120. So whatever that math may be, another 2 hours of your year dedicated to kids in small conversations, how much they will remember those moments. Because as teachers, I'm willing to put money on the fact that all of us at one point received a letter from a young person reminding them or reminding that teacher of something that they did for them, and it was a snapshot in time.
Mm-hmm.
And those are the letters we hold on to, and those are the moments that kids really, really value.
I mean, really what we're talking about is in the classroom, we're not talking about students and kind of generalities, but we're talking about students as individual humans that have equal and unlimited potential. At some point, though, for some reason, and I wrote a little bit about this in my newsletter today around how we talk about schools as things. And I find like one habit that reinforces objectifying a unit of people is calling it a set of things. And I mean, you know this better than I do probably, but I think that we have to change some of the vocabulary when we're describing students or schools or the teachers, because it creates that kind of equalness talk and thinking.
Yeah, it really does. It reduces us to a common denominator that isn't healthy, that isn't productive, that doesn't elevate the nuances that each experience a person has entering one of those buildings, exiting one of those buildings, or exiting, K-12 education, going on to college, or going off to a job. Like we limit the value of each of those units by just naming it like that was school. Like just by the whole generalization, it kind of minimizes it. I think what you also are pointing out is that there's something about a learned experience that no one can replicate the same way for the next person. However, when we talk about it for a group of kids, we're trying to make it the same for everyone. And that's where the inequity really happens. And that happens at the classroom level, which I think instructional resources and a push for culture responsive pedagogy and things like that are trying to cut into that. But there's also just an intentional system that is generated or has been generated for years to uphold this sameness, this desire for equality, when we know equality isn't fair. It's not going to get us to where we want to be for each kid. It's striving for that equity, it's striving for that need for systems to meet kids where they are, for each kid, for each teacher, for each classroom to be successful. We're sitting in the middle of a pandemic. We're sitting in the middle of, again, another racial aggression. We're sitting in the middle of a ton of uncertainty. And then we have this idea we're going back to school, to go back to like this place again. Um, what are things that you believe may now have been brought to the surface that will force that return to look a lot different?
Um, First, I think there are a lot of opposing forces, a lot. And there's groups of folks that just want it to go back the way it was for whatever reason. I mean, I think some people might even think that it's harmless. If it could very well, like the powers to be and the momentum around the way things play out often leads us to those behaviors, and it's just human nature not to want to make change. And so I think that there's these big potholes in front of us that we just need to figure out how to deal with. And unless people start making some very, very uncomfortable moves, we're going to go back to the way things were.
Yeah.
To me, and again, like, just to be completely open, like, to me, like, I texted you this morning. I was like, David, do you think we should get online today? With her, you're like, what do you think? And I was like, oh, I'm going to be courageous, and I think we're going to go online. And I trusted in you that we could have a successful conversation. And we need more of that. Because if we're going to steer the boat a little bit differently, we kind of need to make some choices as schools come back that just look dramatically different than the choices that we've made. And right now, everybody, the recommendations from the governors to the schools to the community are not those hard choices. I mean, I heard so many things about, like, bring us back to normal state to a lot of superintendents.
Yeah. When I read through those guidelines, I've seen a number of states and kind of seen the CDC's kind of flow chart of, once this is done, you can open this. All appropriate for many, many reasons. However, what it's void of is the human aspect of it. We forget that we have 6 and 7-year-old little faces who, maybe barely see above a counter, right? And they're looking up to these adults for guidance. And there's a human interaction that we haven't planned for and we haven't intentionally thought about, and therefore need to create space for those things to happen. And the problem with creating those spaces is that they're dynamic. They're very hard to say, I'm going to say this, and then this 7-year-old is going to say this back to me, and then I can respond this way. That is not how we interact as people. That's not how this conversation is going at all, because we are responding to each other's perspectives. And I feel, my hope, at least, I shouldn't say my feeling is, my hope is that as educators and systems are thinking about returning to school, and in light of what has happened in the past 12 days, let alone past 12 years. And what we're seeing as in regards to this pandemic is that there is a mechanism that triggers a different way that we engage as people and forces us to re-engage in a way that allows us to understand who we are, and de-emphasizes the importance of standardized testing, because at the end of the day, that is not something that's going to necessarily make a Black or brown child feel better coming into a school after hearing about so many challenges that they've just had in their community. It's not going to help that teacher who might be caring for an older family member, or missing their kids that they haven't seen the past 6 months. That is not what we need right now. What we need is understanding and space for conversations.
As we come back to a building with face masks on, and I could tell you, like, just watching the news and all of the protests and pairing the rioting versus the protests and everyone with face masks on, it just felt very different. And I started to think about, like, what will classrooms feel like where kids are wearing face masks and the teachers wearing face masks, and you can't get a lot of the visual cues that you get as a teacher from facial expressions. Are we better off getting to know our kids in an online environment where I don't have to wear a face mask and I could actually see your face? Because I think that, I don't know, in some ways, I'd rather have facial expressions than having a mask where like we're going to have to come up with a whole new set of hand signal routines that people can't communicate how they're feeling or what they're not getting.
Yeah, it's a great point. And I think as I think about my 6-year-old who's going to be looking up to someone with a mask on their face, talking to them, and the images that might create and the challenges that will create for them to understanding that, trying to read people is going to be a lot different. I also then hark upon the reality of, I'm lucky for my son to have a space to sit at a table, to look at a computer screen and to have that interaction, where that is not the case for so many of our children. And if schools go that route, which I think is the better way for them to engage in some ways so that they can have this real space and time, there's an inequity that sits in there. One is the digital divide, where we have, I think the statistics, 15 to 25% of the people in America do not have high-speed internet that allows them to have this conversation. Two, the space, the time, the ability to, communicate through a computer is not accessible to all. So then we will be leaving our most marginalized and under-resourced kids out again. So I think until we solve that, and I think that is a problem we have to solve, we're going to be facing with the challenge of being in school or out. But at the same time, I think there is an opportunity there if we're really trying to push for equity, is to solve for problems rather than say why we can't do X, Y, and Z. I think what will end up happening is that, oh, we can't do that because, or not everyone has, or so then people just eliminate that as a prospect versus trying to find solutions that will allow kids to be successful in this space, to remain safe, and ultimately to get the education they deserve. So folks out there, if you have questions or thoughts, there's no wrong question or comment. We would love to hear from you. It's one of those conversations today where we came off of a weekend and realized we're in a very tough spot in our country, in our world, but most importantly in our hearts, and that we need to talk about it and create a space for people that have questions. We may not have all the answers. We may not have the right ones. We don't know what they are, but we're willing to take them on. So please feel free to ask us questions as we go. Anthony, a question around, here we have more violence against Black people. We have more situations where there is a response, and there's just a vacuum of leadership in so many ways, from different parts of the country all the way up to the top. What is it that we can do? What are the things that you believe we can do? And I will impart some ideas as well. Things that we can do, even if they may not be 100% right, but like when you think of ideas of things we can do to support communities, support school districts, to help them engage their community in a way to get to a better place, what are some of those things we can do?
One of the things that we've always done, at least at Education Elements, is we do the things that we try to have our district partners do, right? So I don't believe that we should be making recommendations or making change without us having embodied that change ourselves. So one of the things that I'm trying to figure out is, how do we engage people in a trusted conversation internally, so that we can have these kinds of conversations you and I regularly have, and other people like get fluent in having it, so that when we're out there, we do it in confidence. Mm-hmm. Because I think it's when we come across as not being confident on what is an equitable approach to making change, is when the minute we get pushback, we fall back on our heels. And what I've noticed and what I've learned in our dialogue is because you've talked about it so much, you're able to talk about it with eloquence, clarity, and approachability. And even our other partner, that we love working with Maria Armstrong at ALAS, but she's very clear on how to make schools more equitable. And what I appreciate about all of the things that I learned from both of you guys is that it's not, let's not overcomplicate it, but let's talk about it frequently so that our our thinking collectively can evolve to something better.
Mhm. I think that's so right. I think because we tend, as people, tend to add layers to problems, we don't actually we don't get to a place where we can take that first taste, that first chunk out of the problem and then move to the next chunk, because we tend to overwhelm ourselves with the layers. And so if nothing else, I feel like the result of that is inaction and moves us away from steps that we can take. And I think one of those first steps is the conversation, but realizing that there's a ton of people that are like, okay, we've had this before. We've had this conversation. What are we going to do? And that gets to the clarity of the statements and actions that people take. It comes to declaring that you stand behind this and you don't agree with that, and making very clear decisions on what position you stand in or stand for in order to then act into that direction. I think there's been a couple school districts that I've seen take stances like that, which promote folks to be more confident in the decisions they're able to make and the opinions they're able to voice, because they know they have the backing of policy and administration and core beliefs of the school system that allow them to venture out and say, actually, no, we're not okay with that action. We're not okay with the way that we over suspend Black and Latino boys. We're not okay with the over identification of special ed kids that are children of color. We have, those districts have space to push against that because there's policy to back that up. Speaking of policy and reform, there's a question from Zachary who's asking, what are some specific reforms you think school systems need to look at? And specifically, he's talking about the discussions around internet and internet access, but is it feasible for certain areas like rural areas to meet that need? So what do you think about that? Are there some specific reforms you think school systems need to look at?
You want me to answer first, right?
I can go first.
All right, you go first this time.
Okay. So yeah, I think there's a few things, right? When you think about systems, I think we need to clarify, when we say systems, what do we mean? And for me, when I think of a system, I'm thinking about a process that creates action from a district leader that impact school or classroom actions. That's some system is creating that. For example, transportation, how kids get to and from school are a system to me, because kids getting to school starts from a district budget line, ultimately creates like hiring people to drive kids, like the whole system comes out of that. So when I think about system reform, I'm thinking about a few very distinct things that drive what we see in classrooms every single day now. One of the things that shows up in our schools academically is that Black and brown kids continue to underperform their white peers. We continue to see the over-suspension and over-regulation of behavior of Black and brown boys in particular, the over-identification of special education kids that are Black and brown. We're continuing to see lower attendance numbers of Black and brown kids, and the well-being, the social emotional well-being, as you look at the Adverse Children Experience, or ACEs study, that identifies that children from under-resourced, high poverty homes experience trauma at a dramatically higher level. So all of these things are a result of some systems issues. And as schools think about reforming their practices, they have to realize what the data is telling them. And so when you take any of those examples, it points directly to the fact that when a child comes to school, the first thing that they're probably realizing is that I'm not in a space yet to open up a book or to do a math problem. I need to know that I am cared for first. And so to care for a child is, how do we help our educators get to a space of rethinking their first interactions with kids or their daily interactions with kids, to start with creating spaces for human interaction and care so that they're able to receive the education that they're going to get after being in a space of being warm and cared for. That comes, though, from a district system lens of saying, when we think of a school day, it's not bell to bell instruction. As much as superintendents probably out there are probably like, why is he saying this? As a former superintendent, I'm saying that bell to bell instruction is not the answer. The answer to me is the opportunity for kids to get a day's worth of experiences that made them better than the day before. And those experiences don't necessarily have to be all academic. So when we think about systems reform, it's thinking about the structure of a school day is one thing that I think schools will and will have to confront because of the pandemic, but more importantly, because of the trauma. I think another thing that comes to mind when we think about, I use suspensions because that is something that is a direct correlation of the school to prison pipeline, is this notion that when we discipline kids, the answer is to put them out. It actually is we need to bring them in. It's kind of the counter, we have to look at it in a counterintuitive way and say, like, actually what kids need more of in challenge and in situations where they may have made a mistake is they need to be brought in and taught and cared for and loved, and again, give an understanding of why that was wrong and why that hurt the community. And so as a district, eliminating some of those no excuses policies and eliminating the mindset that the only way for a kid to get better is to be suspended. So finding out things like that. So I think those are examples of systems that are broken. I can go on and on about a whole bunch of other systems, but I don't want to steal your thunder. I don't want to steal your thunder. What you got?
That's helpful because I think it was at a level of impact that was different than mine. And I think like systems require different levels of impact at the same time. Mine is really about actually this interview I had with Carol Bessel at ASU, and you know her when she was in Missouri. She's making design shifts around this notion that one teacher, one classroom is the solution for our kids. And I think it makes a lot of sense because there's no way a district administrator is going to be able to pick one person that's going to be able to connect with those 100 kids, right? And I think that people change over time, and those kids definitely do. And so really, like, you might have more success when you have a team of teachers able to work with a broader cross section of kids so that they can like figure out how to support not only each other in kind of the teaching part, but they also know how to support different kids. Because I don't think one person can figure out everything. Just like, in our leadership conversations, a lot of times you or I are talking about like, how do we help this one person or help somebody? And we're tackling it from very different ways. And I think kids need that kind of support where multiple adults are thinking about how to like tackle a kid from multiple angles, depending on the context and relationships and things that they have. And the only way we're going to be able to do that is if we pull the notion that there's a set of teachers in one building and we're like, oh, that building, blah, blah, blah. We have to pull those teachers out above the schools and deploy them to schools in a more differentiated way than we are now.
So true. It's so true. It reminds me of, we're both big basketball fans. And if you look at an NBA bench, you often see a head coach, an associate head coach, and then another coach. But then I started to notice, there's like a row of coaches sitting behind the players who just work with the big men, that work with the guards, that work with ball handling, shooting. And so they really, triangulate the challenge with multiple perspectives in a way that makes the individual collectively better, right? It raises the skills of that person because they have so many different angles of people approaching their development. And I think education can do the same thing. I think the challenge that is presented is that we have to find a way to move away from the mindset of one teacher, 25 kids, and 25 desks, or whatever the configuration is. And I think the ability to dream and think outside the box to get there is needed right now. I think that same thing is also needed as we look at society and we look at, we're looking for, the magic solution to a decades, a generational challenge that we have within our community of people of color and of white people and everyone in between who are marginalized or looked at differently if they're not part of the majority. And we need to collectively come together and have a circle of people around the challenge that allow us to get to a better place, just like we do when we think of what our kids need. They need a circle of people around them to become better. We talk a lot about going from conversation to problem solving and creating solutions and then solutions to actions. But we're in a space where I feel like we're looking for someone else to tell us actions, right? So I've been able to speak to some folks in education that are sitting in pretty high seats, and they are in this moment of time where they're looking for that direction. And they're looking for a way to get to the solutions that will take them to the next spot. And then we're in a situation now where we have another tremendous challenge in front of us. And some baby steps are needed. Some baby steps are needed to get to that place. What is the first thing you may just say to someone to read or to talk to or talk about, or a space where they can take those first baby steps to really wrap their minds around what they need to do as an education leader?
Oh man, you're really putting a lot of mental stress on me today. I think I'll go back to how we started this conversation, and it goes back to how do we have conversations like this?
Mm-hmm.
And before, I think there's a well-intentioned tendency for educators and people that we work with to want to do a lot, right? And so the to-do list comes out and they get into granularity and details, and they're like, I feel good when I like fill out as much of this spreadsheet as possible and things that need to get done. And we know we've never gotten all of those things done, right? Otherwise, every district in the country would have met every single strategic plan goal that they've ever listed.
Right.
So what it comes down to is, how do you move away from just checking the box and feeling like you are doing something when you're just writing down a list of things that can be done, and then you come up with excuses as to why they're not? And some of them are in your control, some of them aren't, but we have a tendency to say a lot of them are in our control, whether it's somebody that we work with on our team that just doesn't get it, or whether there's a policy that prevents us from doing what's right. And I talked to some administrators the other day, and I was like, governments don't change policies unless people want it. And so until we get enough people talking about the changes that need to be made in magnified form where their votes will be impacted, those changes aren't going to be made. That's why I never really, there are a lot of organizations that like focus on policy, and they end up talking to the echo chamber. We need to get people to mobilize like people are mobilizing now around how to make changes in our system, including things like seat time issues and other policies that really make it difficult for districts to maneuver. And I'm not saying that we have all of the answers, but I think there are things like that that we do have the opportunity now, as we think about what school looks like come fall, that as a state, we could be like, hey, here are things that we're just not going to be able to do because this is what we need to prioritize now. And I have yet to see that kind of common language yet. Mm-hmm. What about you? What do you think are critical?
Yeah, I think more than ever, leaders need to connect with their community. They need to understand what their community is feeling. They need to connect to the challenge in a real way, and not just the surface way that, I feel like every superintendent has gone through the listening tour and spent 90 days crafting a plan off of meeting with these 5 stakeholder groups for 60 minutes, like all of the things that we know are in that playbook. But actually just sitting down at a local place of worship and listening to individuals about their grandchildren or their children, or visiting a grocery store and having a conversation with the folks that are working in the grocery store who have a 3 or 4 year old who they're worried about their reading development, or finding ways at parks, or now because of COVID, some virtual means, whether it's a text message, whether it's Facebook Live or IG, just spending time with their community to really empathize with the challenge ahead. I think the second piece is, you know, there's a lot of uncomfortable moments that are in the air right now, and they're going to be there for a while. And I think they will continue to cycle through our country because of the history that we have. And in those uncomfortable moments, we have to get closer to a level of feeling comfortable talking more about it. So that means getting more diverse people around a table and include them in that conversation. Way too often in school systems right now, I know for a fact that there are many districts that rely on 4 or 5 people to make the decision for 45,000 people. And those 4 or 5 people, as wonderful as they may be, do not have the understanding of what those 45,000 people need. And so creating spaces for more people to be included, so that there's not only the understanding I spoke about, but there's a factor of getting the voices that are impacted by the decisions to the table to inform a better decision. And then I think the third piece of action, and this is at a high level, and then I actually want to go a little bit more concrete. The third piece is then create something different, create something new, something that is next. And it doesn't, when people hear that, they think Jetsons. They think, the Tesla that was here 5 years ago now flies, right? Like they're thinking very abstract and big, and like when so new and different and next seems a little bit scary, when in reality, it's just us being able to realize the things that we have been doing for years have not helped all of our kids. So that new piece may be just like turning slightly left or turning slightly right on the decision. So now that you're impacting more kids. And a prime example of this is, when we think about our teachers, when we think about hiring our teachers, and when we look at the demographics of our kids, by 2024, over 50% of them will be children of color, while 80% of our teaching force are white individuals, and only 7 or 8% of our teachers are Latinx or Black. What are we doing in our hiring process to change those outcomes? And that little tweak in a hiring process or an interview process that will allow us to understand the skills and gifts that people of color may bring to the classroom could dramatically change the people that enter the field. And so those small tweaks could change the way that we create opportunities. And I say that in a long-winded way of saying that when we try to break down or deconstruct these problems, we have to take the time to understand them deeply. And once we do, I think we can start to take those small steps that people can start tomorrow. But the one thing I would have folks start tomorrow is finding those members in your community that have been trying to get your attention and listen. Start there.
That's great. I guess, I know, I mean, we're getting close to time here, and I do want to give you the opportunity to use this as a way to leave a closing message for our audience, or tell me something that you need from me to help you amplify the messages and the actions that you want taken. So
yeah. Well, I appreciate that. I will say, Anthony, that I've ran across a number of CEOs in my life who are well-meaning and well-intended, but at the same time don't have the same compassion and empathy that you possess every single day in everything you do. And I say that wholeheartedly, that you are deeply working hard to understand this challenge, and that not everyone sees that, and I see that. I appreciate that. I would also say, Anthony, that it's hard. sitting in any seat, in any room, trying to scream as loud as you can and say, this is not right for kids or adults or children, especially people of color in this country, and that no one hears you. And I would hope my message to folks today that are out there is saying that take a stab at listening and then taking action. An action that will change the way that the world is lived for people of color. I was given an example on a call earlier today where I run 5 days a week. And every time I run, I cross the street because I see a white female walking down the street and I don't want any confrontation. And I want to live in a world where I can run past her and not fear that something is going to happen to me and that I'm going to be treated a certain way. And I say that as a 39-year-old man, but what about that 8-year-old child who doesn't know better yet and is still trying to figure out their way? What can we do in education to change that reality for them one day? And so I hope that it's a piece about it's a space and time where we need to think about how we want the world to see us, not from a stance of judgment, but as a human being who needs to see actions taken for the betterment of people versus just words. And so my encouragement is for folks is if you don't know the actions you need to take, find ways and test them out. As you've always pushed us to do, test them out. Test ways to say, like, is this the action I need to take? Try it. Don't stop. Because right now people need to take action for the better of all, but most importantly for those that are so deeply hurt. And unfortunately, over and over again, it's people of color. And so at some point, I hope that changes.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us today.